Okay. I welcome you all for attending this conference on behalf of SETA Foundation and Hacettepe University, since this conference is a joint project organized by SETA and Hacettepe University. Especially I thank Mr. Yılmaz Ensaroğlu and Yavuz Güçtürk from SETA Foundation and Dr. Havva Kök Arslan from Hacettepe University for organizing this event and for bringing us Mr. Kai Jakobsen. Before giving the floor to our speaker, I want to briefly talk about Turkey's position in its mediation activities. As we all know that Turkey is located between three most unstable regions of the world, namely the Middle East, Caucasus, and the Balkans. Throughout the 20th century, Turkey had been considered itself, and it was considered by many states as a social and cultural bridge between the East and the West, between different civilizations. During the Cold War, Turkey had been served as a front country of NATO against the Soviet expansionism towards the Mediterranean. It was part of Western power calculations and American regional projects. However, since the beginning of the 21st century, Turkey decided to be an active member of international system. It began to diversify its foreign relations, to increase its cooperation with regional states, and to pioneer regional initiatives while remaining as an ally of the West and continue its full membership process within the context of the European Union. Under the leadership of AK Party, Turkey abandoned its passive foreign policy and began to take initiatives in regional and international politics. However, its strategic position harbors risks to national, regional, and international security. After following a passive foreign policy for decades, Turkey is now emerging as a significant political and economic actor in its region and in international arena. Until the beginning of the Arab uprisings, Turkey had been acting as a mediator between conflicting states in the Middle East. I will try to mention several of them very briefly. It mediated between different political groups in Iraq, namely between the Kurds, the Sunni Arabs, and the Shiites. It mediated between Lebanon and Syria, and also between Saudi Arabia and Syria during the last decade for several years. Turkey, along with Brazil, mediated between the Islamic Iran and the Western countries. Most importantly, Turkey and its current Prime Minister, Mr. Ahmet Davutoğlu, mediated between the Israeli state and Syria. Most recently, Turkey was a leading country in the mediation delegation for a peace deal signed 2 years ago between the Philippines and the more Islamic Liberation Front based in Mindanao Island. Turkish Ambassador Heidelberg was chairing the international decommissioning body for the rebel groups' handing over of weapons. Turkey has been struggling for a stable, integrated, and normalized Middle East, a region in which all regional states are interdependent to one another. At the same time, Turkey has been struggling for economic integration as well. Recent conflicts and wars, both civil and international ones, in the Middle East challenge Turkey's current position. While Turkey has been supporting a gradual change in the region and using a cooperative political discourse, many other regional states think and behave otherwise and pursue conflictual policies. It's quite timely to discuss Turkey's role in regional and international crises, since there is no constructive state in the Middle East to establish peace and stability. Most regional states are in deep, chaotic political systems. Political legitimacy is questionable in many regional states. The region and the global powers need a stable and mediator Turkey more than ever in today's vulnerable political and economic system. After mentioning these points very briefly, I want to shortly introduce you our speaker, Mr. Kai Jakobsen. He is an international expert in mediation and peace processes, armed violence, conflict prevention, infrastructure for peace, systemic peace building, and post-war recovery. He is also a senior evaluator of peace building, peacemaking, and peace support operations and projects. He is an advisor to several governments and international and national institutions, such as the Commonwealth Secretariat, the OSCE, the UN missions, and the All-Party Parliamentary Working Group on Conflict Issues of the British Parliament. He was a co-founder of the Peace Action Training and Research Institute of Romania, and he was the president of the institute for more than a decade. His presentation is titled as "The Role of Turkey in Dealing with Global and Systemic Challenges." It consists mainly three parts. In the first part, he will give an overview of the current global trends and dynamics around the world. Second, he will identify key recommendations for conflicting sides and explain how to address these trends and dynamics. Finally, he will explore the potential for Turkey to play regional and international role in dealing with regional and systemic challenges. I'm sure that we will hear an insightful presentation from Mr. Jakobsen, and the floor is yours. Here you are. Thank you.
Good morning. I'd like to start by expressing my appreciation and thanks to SETA and to Hacettepe University for making this event possible and for the opportunity to be here and speak with you today. I think we've just had a very, very good and very important introduction to some of the engagements where Turkey has played a leading and a contributing role in a range of different mediation processes. I would add to that also the role that Turkey has played as one of the leaders in the Group of Friends on Mediation of the United Nations, which is a very important fora, as well as its role in the Dialogue of Civilizations of the United Nations, and the annual conference that takes place every year in Turkey, bringing together experts, practitioners, governments, and agencies working in mediation and peace processes around the world. I'd like to, in my presentation this morning, begin by first looking at, let's see if this is working with us, some of the nature of some of the global and systemic challenges that are facing us. So I'm actually going to begin by stepping back first, not focusing specifically on Turkey's role or on the region itself, but looking at the nature of systemic challenges and hoping that together we can gain a deeper understanding of some of the complex crisis and the systemic challenges that are facing us, and also have the opportunity to think and discuss together a bit about the cost of failing to address them effectively. And for that we can also look at some of the examples closer to home and within the region. And then, as was said, having an opportunity, particularly in the interaction and the dialogue session after the presentation as we continue further, to have a dialogue together on what can be the role of Turkey in engaging with these issues, both regionally and at a global level, and also what can we do about them, coming from the different backgrounds that we have. And to harbor this in an appreciation for the difficulty but also the practical responsibility and necessary of finding better, more effective ways of dealing with the crises and the challenges that are facing us regionally and internationally. As a bit of background as well, I've been working extensively throughout the region, throughout the Middle East in particular, from the mid-1990s on. I was involved in Israel-Palestine over a period conducting one of the larger evaluations of peacemaking and peace-building initiatives in Israel-Palestine from 1989 to 2009. To look at what types of processes and efforts were taking place, from formal negotiations, high-level mediation processes and talks, to back-channel processes, and also looking at what was being done by think tanks, universities, civil society organizations, and the full range of actors. From 2009 till 2011, I was also involved as the international research director of a project called Searching for Peace in Iraq, which brought together a joint team of researchers from across Iraq, north, south, and central, as well as international researchers, to look at what were the dynamics that had taken place in the country in the lead up to and following the invasion of Iraq, the descent into extreme sectarian violence and civil war within the country, and what was it that brought it back, as well as looking at the types of policy and decision-making processes that affected that situation. I've also had the opportunity to work in Lebanon extensively and more broadly in a number of countries in the region. One thing I should say is that as an individual and within the Department of Peace Operations, we only work anywhere in the world when we've been invited. We never make project applications to work in other people's countries, and we are only involved if we are asked to be there by those within the countries themselves, and working to provide a supporting role to the processes that they own and drive forward. So if we dive for a moment into looking at some of the systems facing us, this won't be new, I imagine, to any of us, but just to see a brief overview. We are in a period where we are facing a major and growing challenge from environmental difficulties and pollution on a scale which is increasing. These are just some images from around the world. These are pictures from a major oil spill that when I show them in most parts of the world and I ask people, where do you think these come from? The immediate answer is the Gulf of Mexico. That was one of the recent crises that people were more familiar with. These are from the Niger Delta, where the same amount of oil that was released into the Gulf of Mexico is released every single day. Just to give a concept of the scale of the challenge. We face the challenge of climate change, which is increasing. This is one of the world's largest glaciers in 1941. This was a more recent picture from 2004. You can see it has retreated dramatically. If you took an updated picture of that today, then it has gone completely. One of the images which campaigners dealing with these issues often like to use is this one here, because it draws people's sympathy and attention. You have the image of the polar bears as something people feel a connection to. There are previous periods in our history on the planet where we have faced the reality of major and significant climatic change. Those who were here at the time did not deal very well with it. What I'm hoping is that we can do slightly better in how we deal with it today. Insurance companies, disaster management and response capabilities have noted a dramatic, significant, and continuing increase in the scale and intensity of natural disasters. Here we have pictures from Haiti as well, the recent earthquake. We also face the systemic challenge and failure on a global scale to meet the most basic human needs for a large number of the world's population. More than 20,000 children dying every single day from famine and lack of proper nutrition. We have approximately 1 billion people in the world who entered the last century without the capacity to read or to write their name. We have widespread epidemics and diseases, and the concern of the potential failure of antibiotics to be able to respond to many of these challenges. You can see with the recent Ebola outbreaks in Western Africa, also the challenge of systems unable to deal with these issues and the potential increase in spread. Problems like malaria. We are currently spending more money on cigarettes in North America and makeup in Western Europe than the global investment to deal with sub-Saharan and tropical diseases worldwide. Domestic abuse, where we have more people being killed, more women killed within their families and by their husbands than in all the wars in the world put together. The impact of war on societies around the world. And we have also seen in the last 10 years on many levels a worrying increase in the use of torture and violations of human rights by governments and states in many countries. More recently, with 2007, 2008, we have had the outbreak of the financial crisis, leading to instability within countries, but also with regional and systemic repercussions, and the impact of war, and again, humanitarian disasters and emergencies. Homelessness and poverty within many parts of Europe and elsewhere, increasing as well. Just to look for a moment at some global statistics that are identified as issues of concern by risk management and other actors in the field. The combined wealth of the 225 richest people today exceeds $1.5 trillion. We've actually seen a recent study that showed the 85 richest people in the world had more money than the poorest 3.5 billion human beings put together. So we have an extraordinary and increasing inequality in the distribution of wealth. This figure is greater than the wealth of 2.5 billion poorest people, but now we've seen that that's exceeded. The 3 wealthiest men in the world have more money than the world's poorest 48 countries put together. So 3 individuals have more personal capital and wealth than the combined wealth of 48 countries. 24,000 children die each day as a direct result of poverty. Nearly 1 billion people entered the century unable to read or sign their name, as I mentioned. Less than 1% of what the world is currently spending on the production of weapons is more than what it would cost to put every child in the world who is not in school from elementary to university. There are 1.1 billion people in developing countries with inadequate or no access to water and basic sanitation. 2.6 billion, lacking basic sanitation. And one of our challenges is that we still today continue to have a net transfer of wealth from developing countries to the economically wealthier countries. For every $1 that is received in every form of aid and development assistance, there is a net transfer from Africa to Western Europe, North America, Japan, and elsewhere of $2.5 just on debt repayments alone. The recent issue of the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Analysis, this is one of the major publications internationally looking at systemic risks and challenges, both currently facing us and upcoming, defines systemic risks as being characterized by modest tipping points, combining indirectly to produce large failures. It can be small dynamics and events, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which reveals systemic weaknesses brought together from many different factors, leading to large failures and collapse. There is the challenge of risk sharing or contagion, as disruption or instability in one area rapidly spreads, creating a chain reaction of events. And what is called hysteresis, the inability of current systems to deal with or recover from shocks. If we go a bit further in terms of understanding some of the crises we face, Many of today's crises are what we would define as complex. They don't have one single cause, and they don't have one single answer. I've been working in mediation, peace processes, and peace building for nearly 20 years. One of the things that happens very often in dealing with complex conflicts and crises around the world is people ask, what is the answer to this problem? If you have someone come forward and give you a single answer or a neatly packaged solution, that is when you should question and worry. There are usually not simplistic or single answers for how to deal with deep-seated, complex, and challenging issues. Many of the problems that we face today are systemic. They are built into the way that we are dealing with these issues. The way that we are dealing with these issues is themselves creating and producing problems. Bringing us back to Albert Einstein's definition of a contradiction, an issue or a problem that cannot be solved within the system or the logic that has produced it. Thank you. And it's built into the way we're dealing with our economic, political, social, environmental, and other issues, both within countries, regionally, and globally. They require multifaceted, multidimensional solutions, which, and this is one of the key aspects, are often beyond the capacity of any single individuals or stakeholders. So one of the key calls of the 9th issue of the risk publication brought forward by the World Economic Forum is the recognition for the need of innovative approaches and collaboration amongst different key stakeholders, including government, private sectors, civil society, and others who can bring capabilities to addressing these problems. And most importantly, as I've just said, the way we are dealing with many of these challenges today is actually making them worse. And this is one of the issues that it could be interesting and important to discuss. One of the terms that is often used when speaking about systemic challenges is VUCA, in understanding them. It refers to volatility. There's high degrees of change and constant events and dynamics taking place. Uncertainty. There's a lack of clarity of information of exactly what is happening, who is doing what are the motives and interests of different actors. Complexity. Many different actors with different agendas and different approaches involved in the situation. And an ambiguity. There's a lack of clarity of intent or what might happen if different decisions and approaches are taken. This is an illustration of the most significant potential risks that were identified in a survey of more than 600 senior political and business leaders worldwide. The point is to illustrate the interconnectedness of many of the different challenges and issues that we're facing, where weakness or instability in one can then tip over and result in fragility in others. What's interesting is that when looking at the interconnected nature of the challenges and issues we're facing, the ones that they identified as being right at the center, global governance failure, the failure of our global governance capabilities to address these challenges, and political and social instability. You can then replicate this at a regional or country level, where the failure of governance systems to deal with and address the complex and dynamic challenges within, and political and social instability are two of the difficulties we face in trying to find solutions. Another illustration from the same publication asked people to identify not what they see as the crisis we face today, but to look at future trends and dynamics. What do we see as being some of the greatest challenges and difficulties that are currently evolving and that will confront us in coming years and decades? Here you have the education gap. Within many countries, we are seeing the rise of what you could refer to as an apartheid approach to education. The education for the overwhelming majority is being allowed to degrade and to get worse quality, while the wealthier within societies are sending their children to private schools or sending children abroad. That means that the top 1% has access to high quality education, but the education standards of a society are increasingly degrading. One of the largest, ideological polarization. You can see this within the United States, you can see this within Iraq, you can see this within many countries, where the space for people of different opinions, different views of what we want in our society, the space for them to come together in civilized discourse and collaborative interaction with mutual respect is in many areas decreasing. And we're having an increase in the demonization of those who hold views other than ours. In many cases, the criminalization of views which we define as unacceptable. Together with weak institutions, and one of the greatest challenges, it appears small here, but I would suggest something that we need to pay clear attention to, poor leadership. By poor leadership, we are not referring to the leadership of any necessarily single institutions, parties, individuals on a global scale. We're referring to the inability of our leadership and governance models to address many of these challenges. Going further in understanding the concept of crisis, it's traditionally looked at as a time of intense difficulty or danger. If we look at the origins of the word from ancient Greek, interestingly, it involves a separating, the power of distinguishing decision, choice, election, judgment. It's the idea that it is an issue over which there need to be decisions of how we handle it. To pick out, to decide. It was only in late Middle English that it began to be used as denoting a turning point, a moment from normality to one of instability and destabilization, and recognizing that it is a decisive moment. You can also interestingly look within the field of mediation and peace processes. Many practitioners, scholars, and trainers often like to refer to the Chinese symbols for crisis, made up of the combination of two symbols. One is Wei, the symbol for danger or peril, and the other is Ji, opportunity or crucial point, and the concept of Xuanqi, to be able to turn for the better, to turn into an opportunity. The idea that a crisis often represents not only a threat, but an opportunity that, if handled effectively, can enable us to improve our conditions and to deal with situations better. In the face of these crises and challenges, people often feel powerless, overwhelmed, and don't know what we can do to address them. I have worked in areas experiencing armed violence and armed conflict, from Afghanistan and Iraq to Somalia, Sudan, Sri Lanka, Northern Ireland, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and many others around the world. When engaging, whether with individuals in government and state positions or with the broad population, and we ask people, how do you feel about this conflict? How do you feel about the crisis or the war in your country? One of the most consistent responses that people give is powerless. They feel that there is little or nothing that they can do about it. And traditional decision-making structures and responses have proven insufficient to dealing with some of the systemic challenges that we're facing in the world today. A very interesting publication which came out a few years ago by Rebecca da Costa was called The Watchman's Rattle. She uses the metaphor of a watchman. These were the ancient watchmen in medieval Europe, in villages and towns. They used to have wooden rattles. And their task was to pay attention, to be alert at night in case there were raids, attacks, people who would come in and steal, or in case fires or other things broke out which caused a danger to the population. And the watchmen would use their rattle to raise awareness that there was a problem. There was something we needed to pay attention to. And she looks in this publication, The Watchman's Rattle, at the question of why is it that historically some of the greatest civilizations which have existed have all in the end collapsed. She begins by looking at the Roman Empire, the Mayan civilization, the Khmer civilization, and many others. And she explores the work, the publications, the narratives and explanations that have been given by the world's leading academics, experts, and specialists on these issues. Some of them have looked at the failure of governance, sometimes increasing corruption or the inability of the state systems at the time to deal with these problems. Others have looked at the challenge of continual warfare. For example, the explanation of the collapse of the Roman Empire is often given that the cost of continual warfare on the frontiers of the empire drained the resources and was a contributing factor to the collapse of Rome. Other publications, such as Guns, Germs, and Steel, which was a major one in the field some years ago, look at the overexploitation of natural resources and the collapse of the environmental base as contributing. What Rebecca da Costa points out is that, in fact, to varying degrees, all of these explanations are correct. In each of the different cases, it wasn't a single causal factor that led to the collapse. It was the combination of several of these challenges. But she also points out that that is not the point. That in having that discussion, we are failing to address and identify what should be the critical issue that we look at. And what she identifies as that critical issue is that none of these problems appeared overnight. None of these problems suddenly appeared and proved overwhelming. She asked the question, why is it that what we consider the most evolved cultures and civilizations, the most evolved governance structures of their time, were unable to find solutions to challenges which built up over years and decades? The underlying structural factors and problems which have provided the soil, the context in which the current violence taking place across Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and the region is happening, did not appear overnight. So she points that the issue we need to identify and address is what has blocked our ability to find solutions to these systemic challenges and problems. Some of what she identifies: cognitive failure, our inability to understand the nature and the complexity of these challenges, our failure intellectually and in our disciplines and understanding to properly address the challenges. Siloed thinking. You have people each looking at it from their different approaches. Some looking at it from a security approach, some looking at it from an environmental approach, some looking at it from a political approach, and the inability to bring together the different lenses that enable us to understand these challenges and to see what could be possible solutions. Blame and scapegoats. Instead of actually looking at the challenge and working to address it, blaming the individuals or the groups which we hold responsible. So, for example, in Nepal, several years into the war, you couldn't speak about the conflict in Nepal or identify there being actual issues. It was simply called the Maoist problem. If it's a Maoist problem, then everything would be fine as long as we get rid of the Maoists. So blaming an actor instead of looking at the structure, the conditions, the underlying drivers and root causes which give rise to it. Faulty premises or memes. Faulty understanding, guiding policy, often fueling and making the situation worse. A classic example in Iraq, much of U.S. thinking in 2003, 2004, 2005 was that those who were opposing the occupation and the military presence in Iraq were diehards and regime dead-enders. those who would have resisted no matter what and were simply opposing because they had no other alternative. We now have transcripts of the records of the debriefing of captured combatants and captured insurgents in Iraq from the US occupation forces. And they're extremely clear in why they were fighting. And it was because of their systematic exclusion from opportunities to take part in governance and to have a role in defining the future of Iraq. It was from the fact that when the occupation began, those who had felt they would have a role were systematically marginalized. But the thinking guiding the occupation authorities and the military approach was based upon a faulty understanding, which prevented them from being able to engage effectively. Failure to constructively engage with diversity and to see diversity as a threat. And reinforcing myths. And lack of systems of accountability. The ability to take action, to take decisions, but there is no accountability for when there are negative repercussions. The other challenge is that many of the difficulties that we are facing, she likens and compares them to lily pads. Do you know the phenomenon of lily pads in the water and how they grow? They grow through multiplication. If on the first day you have 1, the next day you have 2, the next day you have 4, the next day you have 16. The challenge is, the day before the tipping point, things still look okay. But then, when an event happens, it brings it over the tipping point, brings it over the scale in terms of our ability to deal with it. All of the structural factors which led to the financial crisis in 2007, 2008 were evident for years ahead of time. But our ideological blinders and parameters, our reinforcing myths, our faulty premises, led us to believe that there was not a challenge until the tipping point and the trigger events that bring it over the edge. To give another example in terms of policy decisions and failures in Iraq, many of the key decisions taken both regarding the invasion of Iraq but also in the occupation of Iraq afterwards were strongly ideologically driven. If you look at the hiring patterns of the coalition provisional authorities and the occupation authorities in Iraq, they were based not upon proficiency and capability, but upon ideological soundness. If you agreed with the ruling party in the United States and the Republican Party, you would be hired for the positions, not necessarily based upon capability. There was poor intelligence and the capacity to understand the situation in Iraq, based upon a faulty misunderstanding or a fundamental misunderstanding. Low-level capabilities. Many of those who had the expertise, the knowledge to handle situations more effectively were systematically removed. That included everything from senior generals in the Pentagon who were able to say this approach will make things worse, and many of whom cautioned against invasion, to on the ground, the people involved. For example, the individual who is responsible for the re-establishing the Baghdad municipal water system after the war was a 21-year-old university student who had never had a previous job. And again, the absence of accountability or correction mechanisms. What's some of the good news? We could go much more into this. I'm providing this as a preface to the discussion for us to have to follow. As a species, we have an extraordinary capacity to deal with challenges. Today, we have a greater productive, scientific, and innovative capacity than at perhaps any other time in the history of our existence as a species. The knowledge, skills, and tools that we need to deal with many of the challenges we face, or to find solutions to how we can deal with them, exist. But we are often not applying them, and we're often not drawing upon the full potential we have to address these challenges. So what can we do? Finding solutions to complexity. There's much more that we could go into on this. I'm going to present just a little bit and then perhaps open up for a discussion and begin by really focusing on the situation within the region and Turkey's role in dealing with these issues. I just want to share two things to think of. This picture used to be more acceptable to use 10 years ago, less so now after his crash into the tree and some of the issues that got revealed. But there was an interesting interview with Tiger Woods. I should preface this by saying I've never held a golf club and I have no experience or background in golfing. But Tiger Woods was once asked, how is it possible that you are the greatest golfer in the world? How is it that after so many years you've managed to have a performance of excellence? And at that time he was seen as being undoubtedly the greatest golfer that there had been. The answer he gave was interesting. He said, I watched the videos of my successful shots. He looks at what he did right and tries to learn from that. There's an important lesson here in that very often within the field of political scientists, security studies, strategy studies, and others, we focus on analyzing problems, what has been done wrong. And there's often not enough of a focus on drawing from models and examples of success. What has worked well, and how can we learn from that? Are there lessons? Are there opportunities to replicate that success? Another interesting indicator or guide comes from the field of cancer research, as a metaphor or parallel. There was a publication in Time magazine just a few years ago which looked at a new approach to how cancer is being researched and dealt with. And it was being pioneered by three individuals. These are all huge media celebrities. One was the CEO of Paramount Studios. One was an owner of another major media corporation. One was one of America's most senior broadcasters. All of them had experience with cancer. In two cases, their husbands had it. In one case, the individual had it, and she died shortly after this photo was taken from cancer. They were frustrated with what they saw as how cancer was being dealt with. At that time, they would go to many different doctors, and each of them would give them a different answer for how to deal with the situation or what was the problem. There was little communication or coordination amongst doctors. There were different areas of the medical health field which were not cooperating or working together. What they did was they said, how could we take what they called a Hollywood approach to the issue? What would happen if we actually gave the resources that were needed to dealing with this? If we brought the money that was necessary, and if we created what they called dream teams, we brought together the different experts who had the capabilities, the knowledge for working on these issues, and got them to collaborate together. And for the first time, they put the money behind it, and with conditions that different key actors who had the expertise and the knowledge necessary would come and would work together in finding these solutions. They managed to move from what had traditionally been the rate of progress of taking 5 to 10 years to introduce new drugs and new medicines, to introducing in 3 to 6 months medicines which led to 90% reductions in fatalities for the cancers that they were addressing. So this aspect of overcoming silos, overcoming some of the traditional structures and approaches of dealing with it, and bringing together the spectrum of actors that can be part of the solution for dealing with the problem. Before opening up for discussion and going then into speaking about the situation specifically within the region, what is happening now in Turkey, in Syria, Iraq, what could be some of the role of Turkey in dealing with these issues both regionally and internationally. Just to end with a quote to open that discussion. When people see the scale of the challenges we're facing, when you look at what's happening now in Syria, or I was just speaking recently with some people in northern Iraq displaced by the fighting with ISIS and Daesh, often it causes people to feel that it is overwhelming and that there is little that can be done. A quote that I've often found encouraging: I am not an optimist nor a pessimist, but I have hope, born of the choices I make and the actions I take. The situation we're facing now in the region is one in which over more than a decade we've had increasing instability. the underlying drivers and dynamics fueling what is happening now in Iraq and Syria do not necessarily have simple or easy solutions. But it is the choices that we make and how to deal with them and the actions that we take which will define whether they continue, intensify, or escalate violence and instability, or whether we're able to find effective solutions and answers to these challenges. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. And now we'll open the floor for questions and comments. Do you want to say something about Turkey's roles? Then we'll try to have questions.
So,
if you can, please.
I've had the opportunity over the last few years to be traveling to Turkey and engaging more and more with a range of different actors here, including what I find to be an extremely exciting new program that has been launched by Hacettepe University, an international MA in Peace Studies that is based here in Turkey. I've taught previously at Oxford University, Columbia, many other graduate programs around the world in the field. But one of the reasons that I find this particular program in Turkey to be the most exciting is that it not only flies in some of the world's leading experts from all over the world and leading experts from Turkey, but the student body comes from all over the world. And there's a much more representative presence than you find at some of the programs in Western Europe and North America. In engagement with that program, we've had the opportunity to be meeting and discussing with people in Turkey as well, and for myself to go deeper into the role of Turkey within the region. Previously, in working in Iraq, in Lebanon, and elsewhere, you could also see some of Turkey's involvement in these mediation processes. I think the reality that you presented, that Turkey is at the epicenter of 3 different regions which have been faced with instability and crisis. And I would also add Northern Africa, where many of the countries have been exploring and looking to Turkey as a model. Turkey has a number of contributions that it can make. One, as an example and a model of a country dealing with extraordinary diversity across the country. 2, Turkey has taken upon itself in recent years, and this has been affected somewhat in the last years, but earlier, to play a contributing role in assisting and facilitating mediation processes. There are very few countries in the world that do that. Turkey, because of its cultural and historical background, often has relationships with these countries. And because of the decisions of the government to take a constructive role, has an opportunity to contribute to assisting and facilitating in these processes. And that's something that, as someone who has worked in this field for quite some time, we would see as very significant. Prior to Turkey's engagement and some roles by Malaysia and Indonesia, you primarily only had countries from Western Europe and North America that were engaging to provide facilitating roles for mediation processes. Turkey brings a very different profile to that, and it brings a legacy and a history of contacts with some of these areas that can give it a different angle in its support. I would say the other role that Turkey can potentially play in the coming years is as a success model if some of the key conflict situations that Turkey itself is involved in, both domestically in terms of the Turkish-Kurdish peace process, but also in Cyprus and also in relations between Turkey and Armenia. Over the last 5-6 years, there has been back and forth on each of these processes. There's been some progress, there have been some challenges. But if these processes come to fruition, then Turkey will be an example that is actually looked at internationally by many other processes in terms of what can we learn from that. So the same way that today, and for the last nearly 2 decades, people have spoken about what can be learned from Northern Ireland, what can be learned from South Africa, there is an opportunity for Turkey, if it is able to complete these processes and bring them to fruition, to actually become a global model or a success story that can inspire and contribute to mediation and peace processes elsewhere. At the moment, if we look at some of the more difficult situations in the region, the current escalation of instability within Iraq and the escalating violence within Syria, I think what would be very interesting would be to have an opportunity to hear people's perspectives on these and open up into a dialogue, and then discuss what could be some of the possibilities on them and some of the role that Turkey could play in that respect.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think the audience will continue with discussion on the latest points that you made regarding the Turkish politics. And the floor is yours, dear audience. Do you have any questions? Sorusu olan?
So questions, comments, both feedback, but also if there's issues that you'd like to raise in terms of the focal topic of what you would see as Turkey's role and contribution, both regionally and more broadly.
Okay, yes?
Maybe I'll try to be an icebreaker.
Teşekkür.
I'm Ömer Atalar, member of the Caucasian Associations Federations based in Ankara. And we are a small minority within Turkey, coming from one of those 3 conflict zones, Caucasia. But my question will have 2 aspects. One is about Abkhazia. You know, there's a stalemate, but there's no solution for the conflict there yet. And the other is Kurdish issue and its relation with the ISIS problem. The Kurdish side, blames the government of supporting ISIS. This doesn't help the peace process. While you are conducting a peace process, you have to respect, both sides. The Kurdish side is collaborating. I don't want to say the government, but the pro-government side claims that the Syrian Kurds support Assad while the government is in a state of war, in brackets. The Kurdish side didn't respect the government while they are on the peace process and on the table. On the other side, the government had some kind of role in supporting ISIS, and this also doesn't help the peace process. This is a dilemma, and I fully agree with the quote you made. If Turkey solves the Kurdish issue, it will be an example for the future conflicts of the world. This is a deep-rooted issue dating back to Ottoman and even pro-Ottoman times. So that's a problem, but the way we are dealing it is not going so well. These days, there's a huge question mark on the peace process, and sometimes some smaller gains are putting the process into the risk. The near future's gains, such as the collaboration with Assad for the Kurds and supporting ISIS for the other side, these are short-term gains. But in the long term, the real gain is the success of the peace process, and we are putting this into a risk. And at the other side, there's the Abkhazian question. There's a conflict dating back to Stalin's time. Abkhazia belongs to the northern Caucasian culture, and the nation is one of our nations in the region. The Circassian and Abkhazian culture is the same. They are the same nation in one way. But the Stalin divide and impera politics made it some solutions for Caucasian region. Different nations put into one state. They make it in Crimea. They make it in Kabardino-Balkaria, Karachay-Cherkesk, and also this Abkhazian issue is the same. Georgians and Abkhazians are put into the same state so that they conflict and seek solution from Moscow. But today, the Moscow doesn't have effect on Georgia after the Soviet time. And at our border, we have a problem. There are ships sailing to Abkhazia, and they are confiscated by the Georgian Navy. The personnel of those ships were jailed, etc. Such human rights abuses and etc. But the real issue, the bigger issue is there's a huge and very nice region which is not recognized by the world as a state and which is not on the status quo part of the Georgia at the moment. This is an ongoing crisis, and Turkey should maybe think about playing a positive role rather than saying that the legitimate borders of Georgia, but that's not the reality. Legitimate borders of the Iraq, that's not the reality. Legitimate borders of the Syria. This rhetoric doesn't work anymore. So we need to step up one level up, as Einstein stated.
Question the legitimacy of borders.
Yeah,
okay.
Well, of course. In the Kurdish issue, when you are trying to solve the problem within the Turkey, it has effects in Iran, in Syria, in Iraq. I'll stop here and I'll thank for your
There are many issues and challenging questions in what you brought up. I'd like to try and reflect on them. I think if we're to take a step back, one of the greatest challenges that we're facing today in the Middle East, and it has significant repercussions throughout the entire region, is we have very pronounced competing policies of key countries in the region supporting competing factors within each of the conflict areas, within Lebanon, within Iraq, within Syria. Qatar has its allies, Yemen has its allies, Turkey has its allies, Saudi Arabia has its allies, Iran has its allies. And in some cases, there's mixed. Who we support in one area is different than another area. Who is supporting our opponents here is supporting our allies there. But the challenge is that what we have seen is the increasing acceptance and willingness of neighboring countries to support armed groups within the borders of countries within the region. And this opens up an extremely dangerous can of worms. We saw something very similar in Central America in the 1970s and 80s, where you had civil wars in each of the countries, and where the government in one country would be supporting armed groups in the other country because the other government was supporting armed groups in their own countries. What happened was this presented a difficult scenario for finding solutions to any one of the problems because they were intricately interlinked with the others. What eventually evolved is what was called the Contadora process in the Episcopales Accords, where the regional actors were brought together to look at developing a regional framework based upon certain key principles, including the non-intervention in the internal policies of the neighboring countries. We would no longer support armed groups within your country if you do not support armed groups within ours, tied to the requirement of developing national peace processes, that within each country it was required for the government at that time to engage in a process to look at how to deal with key issues of representation, power sharing, constitutionality, and the rights of the different communities that were involved in the conflict. A key term that was developed by the CIA throughout the 1980s in relation to the war in Afghanistan and what we saw afterwards throughout the 1990s is the concept of blowback. There is a significant risk that if we support armed groups within one area, that can develop a momentum of escalating violence where you don't know what direction that will go in further. So there's the challenge that we're now in a context where Syria, a country which did face significant governance challenges, did face significant human rights challenges, has now been devastated by a civil war over 3 years, the continual flooding of weapons into the region, and acting as a recruitment force for actors who are seeing violence as a way of dealing with these conflict situations. The same way that the actors fueling and supporting the conflict in Syria are not bound by national boundaries, the potential repercussions of that will not be limited to national boundaries, as we've seen with Daesh now spreading across northern Iraq and the dynamics in Syria mixing then with the internal within Iraq. Continuing those policies will not necessarily provide an approach to solving these situations. And that's one of the challenges. Right now, we are in one of the most unstable periods within the region. And it's not easy from the middle of that context to see how to step out of it. But that's where I find the role that Turkey and the current prime minister was pioneering for many years. The policy not only of no conflicts with neighbors, but combining no conflicts with then a proactive policy of building relations and contributing to mediation and peace processes. And Turkey was playing a very innovative role there. I'd actually also like to ask for your recommendations, because in Bahrain in March, I've been asked to give a speech to 600 of the most senior business leaders from across the region to look at the economic impacts of war, conflict, and peace in the Middle East. And here we have 600 individuals who are concerned by the fact that the escalating armed violence across the region and the instability is working as a significant impediment to economic development and social and governance sustainability within the region. How can that be addressed? In the case of the situation of Abkhazia, and you can also look at South Ossetia, Transnistria, Piednestrovia, we have a challenge where there are a number of areas that have developed as de facto separated regions. And that is part of what the conflict is about. They are questioning the constitutionality of the existing states to govern over them. And here's where also Turkey, in looking how to deal with these situations within the country, can present an interesting model. You've had historically a struggle which was seen, at least by many, as trying to create an independent state, and that was something that there was significant conflict over. Are there alternative models? Are there ways of realizing the rights and protecting the cultures and identities of communities with or without having to create independent states? And there are both the conflicts within the Caucasus as well as many around the world. This is not an isolated issue. And we need to find ways of dealing with these challenges by engaging in supporting mediation processes, by engaging with dealing with the internal conflicts within Turkey, and also by fostering the development of international programs, such as that at Hacettepe University, which provide an opportunity to study these issues. Turkey can be contributing to trying to find innovative approaches and solutions and not reinforcing broken models.
Okay. So we have questions back there, then in front.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobson. I'm Salman Keskin, PhD student at Gazi University and also research assistant. I want to ask you something about religion. For you, what's the role of religion to deal with the problems, to solve the conflicts? It's a kind of solution of the problem or source of problem. What do you think about that? Thank you.
Should we take a few questions?
It would be better to have some other questions here in front.
Well, actually, I have a question and comments, so it will take a longer. So I'm Yunus Turhan, PhD student, Middle East Technical University. My comment about your presentation, first of all, it's really fruitful and effectful, but mostly you focus on identification of the problems or diagnosis of problem, but what I expected is more implementation or alternative solution of the problems. It could be more, converge to find a realist perspective, not idealist perspective. So my comment, for example, in today's issue, when we look at the Middle East and Northern African issues, for example, we can say that democracy can be one kind of solution to solve the problems. But actually, when we look at the reality, 2 weeks ago, there was an election in Tunisia. Nida Tunis party secular party came to power. And they look at the Egypt also. Now European or the big powers prefer secular dictatorship rather than this elected Islamist. So democracy is not a problem, is not a solution. And another issue is, yes, the peace process or peace implementation are really crucial in solution of problems, but we should focus on where the causes has been arising. Where is the source? For example, there is a big discussion in Turkey, world is bigger than 5. It's quite important for me because the current systems, as you really mentioned about the systems, structure, I think the sources to problem is structure. So as long as we don't change the structure of systems, the problem will erupt. We can solve the Egypt problem, we can solve the Iraq problem, but it will erupt in Singapore, it will erupt in African countries. So as long as this structure, the systems continue, we will face this kind of problems forever. So I think peace process should focus more on the structural change. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, adding one point to his comment, when you talk about the failure of the global governance, I thought about the United Nations. As he mentioned that the world is bigger than 5. It doesn't matter whether it's bigger or not, but the problem with the governance is the United Nations or the Security Council or the Big 5 unfortunately cannot deal with the global crisis. They cannot manage it. So it's a problem. It's a failure in the context of the United Nations. And we have another question here, or a comment from Mr. İlnur Çevik. Here.
I'm İlnur Çevik, the former editor-in-chief of the Turkish Daily News, and I'm also now the chief columnist for Daily Sabah. I'm also the advisor to the president of Hacettepe University on press issues and media. Now, I have been listening with great interest to your presentation, and I thank you for it, but I think there are certain points that we have to look into, like xenophobia was a very big problem, and it is continuing to be a growing problem in the world, a major conflict area, I think. I think we could add to the list of your problems. But there's a bigger problem that is coming up, is Islamophobia. Now, yes, several people who call themselves Muslims are unfortunately not angels. However, we do have a problem of Islamophobia, which is spreading throughout Europe, and Turkey's Religious Affairs Department, Diyanet, is underlining this problem and trying to counter it, but I feel that it is going to be a bigger issue in the future. It is already an issue, but it's going to be even a bigger issue with all these ISIS and other crises coming up all around the place, and the word of Islam being defamed as such. I think we have a major conflict area there. I'd like your views on this. And the other point is, of course, you mentioned Cyprus and you mentioned the Armenian issue. Now, regarding Cyprus, I have been involved in foreign policy for 42 years. I've been Mr. Demirel's, Mr. Erbakan's chief advisor on these issues. And when we come to this, now Cyprus, as you have monitored, I'm sure, over the years, we have our ups and downs, but it's always downs because we never end up. We come an inch to a solution and suddenly something happens and the negotiations fall. The latest is we were about to end this problem, but unfortunately the Greeks reneged and they withdrew from the talks, saying that Turkey was trying to stall their oil exploration rights. Now, here, the problem, of course, is not whether Turkey can solve it, But is Turkey getting encouragement from the West to solve this problem? The United States says it wants to solve the problem, but the European Union is unfortunately doing nothing. On the contrary, the fact that they accepted the Greek Cypriot side as a member is further alleviating the problem rather than solving it. Yes, we do want to solve the problem on Cyprus, but how? When there is so much outside interference, and the Armenian issue as well. This year, 2015, as you know, is the 100th anniversary. And we will again be facing a very controversial Congress, especially after the current elections. Yes, the Republicans do not look too as hawkishly as the Democrats did to the Armenian resolution, but the Armenians are going to throw everything at it. It's the 100th year. They have to prove something. And here, again, there is an area which is out of your hands. How do you deal with that to solve your problems and then turn to the world and say, look, we've solved them all. Come on, let us be an example to you. Thank you.
Okay, for your comments and questions, I think it's very significant that you have mentioned interconnectedness of the problems and the complexity. So there is not only regional actors dealing with the solution or the management of the crisis, but the global one.
Exactly.
And the question is, they do not take the regional considerations into account. So
several superb points raised, and there's also one from the first question about the Kurdish-Turkish comments on each other in relation to engagement in Syria, which I didn't get to. I'm going to open up a can of worms even further. I was being asked the question yesterday of my view of the Turkish accession process to the European Union. And I would just raise that I have been a very strong supporter and believed that Turkey should be encouraged and given all support for entry into the European Union for many years. That was my point of view. I felt that the European Union would be much richer with Turkey as a member, and I felt also that engagement in the European Union, as for many countries that have joined the EU, would bring positive benefits for Turkey. I'm not so sure anymore. Not because of not seeing the value of Turkish membership of the EU, but because I also believe that Turkey can play a more significant role on many issues by divining its own foreign policy path. So you can see within the European Union today, it is hard to point to any one country that plays a significant leadership role. And the EU as a whole is bogged down, so it's unable to. Whereas Turkey, over the last several years, when it began to, as SETA and as you framed it this morning, develop a more active foreign policy, Turkey has been evolving what can be a leading role, but it interplays with other actors, and what role do they play? In terms of the issue of brought up diagnosis and many problems, but without going enough in depth into how can we deal with them, which I'd like us to do together right now, I often use the parallel of if you go to a doctor and the doctor tells you you have cancer, and then the doctor walks out of the room. What would you think of that doctor? That's not enough. We expect that doctors aren't only able to analyze, define, and describe the nature of the problem, but also make the effort to engage in looking at how we come up with solutions and what can be done. And that is an area where we need to invest much more in our work, both at academia, in political science, international relations, and others. They excel at analysis of problems, but not on generation of solutions. So let's take that challenge and try and look towards some solutions. Dealing with the first question, is religion a positive or negative contributor to dealing with conflict? If my students in the course this week, where we're doing conflict analysis, identified religion as positive or negative, I would fail them. Because I would suggest that it is both and neither. What matters is how you engage with it. I used to go to Islamic school every Friday when I was growing up for a period in Canada, because one of my closest friends, Mustafa Kamal, was from Kashmir. And I wanted to learn and to understand from his culture and his traditions and backgrounds. I was deeply inspired by the teachings of the Holy Quran as I understood them and had them shared with me. Passages of, for example, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the story where he had the garbage thrown on him every day by the woman who sought to humiliate him. And then one day, the garbage wasn't thrown on him. And he tried to understand why. And he went up and he found that she was sick. So this person who had humiliated him every day, and he had not responded to that humiliation, was sick and in need. And he began to care for her. And then the story continues that she converted to Islam and became a companion with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It says in the Holy Quran, he who walks with peace, walk with him. I would also suggest she who walks with peace, walk with her. And to kill the least amongst my creation is the same as to kill all of creation. You can also look within the New Testament, you can look within the teachings of the Buddha, you can look within many traditions and beliefs and find powerful messages for peace. In fact, many of those who we celebrate historically, when you ask people for great leaders throughout history, you often get the names of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, many others. At the same time, there are also elements within many religious teachings which do promote, celebrate, or legitimize the use of violence. And I don't think that it's necessarily healthy within any religion to try and simply say, well, that's an abuse of the teachings, or that's a misinterpretation. Very often, it's actually quite explicit in terms of endorsing or promoting violence. So it's not about either or. You can find messages that go both ways. What I do find very dangerous, and this connects with the question that came up now, is we are seeing increasing extremism in the use of religion or in the name of religion, not without historical precedents. This still pales in comparison to what we saw during the Crusades. That was much larger. And it is not limited to Islam. So when we, for example, speak about how do we address groups like Daesh or ISIS, I would put in the same context, how do we address the decision-making of states which have brought us into war over the last decades? The wars in Iraq, the wars in Afghanistan, which were not necessarily justified using the terminology of religion, but many precepts were certainly built into the thinking of those who had leadership roles on it. There have been calls by many religious leaders to look within their traditions and their teachings and encouraging religious followers to draw upon the best aspects of their faith, to celebrate diversity, and to work to develop and cultivate dialogue. And I believe we need to encourage that. Having engaged extensively in Iraq and looking at what is it that brought from the extreme levels of violence that it reached, escalating through 2004, 2005, to then, now it has gone up again, but there was a period where it went down. The international discourse from the West, and what many academics and others promote, is the mythology of Petraeus and the Surge. And that it was the US military surge, the increasing of forces on the ground, which led to a decrease in violence. The dramatic reduction and decrease in violent trends in Iraq had already happened before the surge began. Why did it happen? There were a number of factors. There was the courageous role of Shia and Sunni religious leaders at local levels who began to engage with their communities, seeing the devastating violence and the effect it was having. Also, community leaders, social leaders, business leaders, secular leaders who tried to pull their society back together. There was Ayatollah al-Sistani, who called upon all of the people of faith in Iraq to end the sectarian violence. And there were the actions of Muqtada al-Sadr calling upon his own forces to cease fire and to reduce, not necessarily because of a change of heart, but because he began to lose control of his own movement. And you had certain commanders who were beginning to challenge his authority, and you also had increasing criminal elements who said they were acting within the Sadr movement, but were using it for their own benefit. Iraq pulled back from the extreme abyss of sectarian violence because of internal actions within Iraq, and also local commanders of US forces who went against their orders and made deals with Al-Qaeda in Iraq and with other actors. We will not go in these areas if you do not attack us, because they didn't want their soldiers going home in body bags. Then you had changes at a higher policy level in the United States. And you had Sunni tribes turning against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, because Al-Qaeda tried to impose their own rule and to push away the tribal structures. And they began to fight back, and that was essential. But they began to fight back because they also had the promise held out to them that you will have a role in future governance. When that promise was systematically violated over the last years, including with charging the vice president with terrorism so that he had to leave the country, but also increasing control by one party of security institutions, of governance structures, then you had the Sunni in Iraq provide a space for Daesh to come forward. So a repetition in some ways of what happened, where they provided the space also for Al-Qaeda in Iraq and other insurgent groups earlier. But the key was solving that issue was an issue of governance, an issue of ensuring that these people would have a voice and a future in the role of their country. The difficulty now is that, given the betrayal of that promise earlier, it will be that much harder to convince them going forward that this could be a solution. The issues of realist or idealist in looking at MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, one of the things that I bring forward very clearly, we need to change our narrative and change our use of these terms. It is not realist to continue with broken military policies. So traditionally, realist has been an analysis based upon security, threat identification, and supporting military measures to deal. That is not realism. That is dangerous ideology, because it is pursuing policies which increase violence, instability, and make the situation worse. Realism is to identify the nature of the problem, the complexity of it, and the necessity to bring innovative and effective solutions. That's not idealism, it's practicality. What can those be? Within the MENA region, I don't think it's an issue of our being able to say democracy is good, democracy is bad, it doesn't provide a solution. We need a much more realistic approach of what is involved in transition and the challenges. In Romania, we're more than 20 years after transition. We're a member of the European Union, and people still speak about the transition process up until about a year or two ago. Alejandro Bendaña, who used to be a member of the Sandinista movement in Nicaragua, when he was younger than almost everyone in this room, involved in overthrowing one of the worst dictatorships in Central America, then became Secretary General of the Foreign Ministry, Ambassador to the United Nations. He works all over the world today dealing with demobilization of combatants after wars and reintegration of combatant groups, and also looking at issues of transition. One of the things he points out is, if you had a certain regime style for 5, 10, 20 years, if you had a war for 5, 10, 20 years, you will not change that overnight. It will take 5, 10, 20 years. The removal of the regime in Egypt brought to the surface the numerous complexities and contradictions within Egyptian society and into open conflict. And unfortunately, there were not enough mechanisms, spaces to responsibly engage with that, to bring forward the competing voices and needs of the different factions of society, which have fundamentally different views of what they want Egypt to be. And your political process needs to be able to engage with that, not to demonize and label as enemies the ones who have different views than you, but to recognize the reality. For example, in Egyptian society, you do have a very large, what considers themselves secular population, and believe that it was the responsibility of the former regime to control and govern progress in Egypt, and saw, in this case, the Islamic Brotherhood as a threat. the Islamic Brotherhood, as well as other actors, had different views and represented significant portions of the Egyptian population. When the Islamic Brotherhood took governance, one of the things that we neglect in analyzing the situation, I was meeting with those who were involved in Tahrir Square and in the demonstrations, and what was amazing was these people were passionate, they were inspired, they were excited by the opportunities of opening for new futures for Egypt, of overcoming the legacy of decades of an authoritarian regime. And they were passionate about discussing politics. And many of them were surprised in the elections which followed at how badly their parties did. But I was surprised they were surprised. Because if you go into rural areas in Egypt and you meet and you speak with people, what is one of the things that you see? One, fundamental distrust of politicians and government. So if you bring people who are passionate about speaking about politics and that excites them and makes them passionate and want to get more involved, and they're talking about politics and what they're going to do, and they don't have connections with rural areas. They don't have connections with, and they often don't identify with much of the culture, traditions, and values in these areas. It's not surprising that they didn't get votes. And the other aspect is, what was a local structure within many of these areas? The mosque. And many people, when they were voting for local religious leaders who they felt were less corrupt and who they trusted more. And that was why, or one of the factors of why you had such a significant showing of the Islamic Brotherhood and others around them, the Muslim Brotherhood. What then happened after? The reality is there was a conflict being waged over the future direction of Egyptian society. Much more could have been done by the Brotherhood to develop collaborative engagement with other factors. But the reality is when you've been in opposition underground and in prison for decades, you don't necessarily come out knowing how to manage a very difficult transition process. These are complex. We completely did it terribly throughout Eastern Europe. And if it wasn't for massive support plus strong state structures, things could have gone even much worse. The other aspect was the reality that police didn't show up to do their jobs. So people were frustrated by increasing criminality and crimes. That was in part because there was an orchestrated policy within the police and the intelligence services not to support the regime. So you had problems growing. You also had the orchestrated shortages of gas, which were causing frustrations for people. Isn't it miraculous that the second the military steps back in, gas begins to flow and prices go down? But to show the interconnected nature of problems again, the drought in Russia in 2010, which had led to reduced agricultural exports, which led to increased cost of agricultural goods in northern African countries, which was one of the direct grievances preceding the risings as well, so showing the interconnected nature. My point is that democracy is not a process of elections and 50+1. That's how we've traditionally understood it. But what we often then get is demagogia. You get people campaigning to their constituencies, making promises, and often it escalates conflict. We had a process with the Commonwealth Secretariat in London a few years ago, bringing together members of all of the Commonwealth countries. And we were looking at issues of preventing violence within the Commonwealth. One of the things that was identified is an overwhelming majority of cases of violating the constitutional order, coup d'etat, and civil wars in Commonwealth countries were breaking out before, during, or around elections. Why? Because elections are periods of concentrated competition for control of the state. And if your governance system means that when you get control of the state, you rule it for the next 4 or 5 years, the opposition is marginalized and you have patronage-based politics. It's not only that you are getting into government, you now reward your followers, your supporters, and those around you. If that is the system of governance, it becomes zero-sum. It becomes all or nothing. And that is why you often have violence around it. The challenge that Egypt, Tunisia, many countries in the region are facing is that there was a superficial presentation of a single identity, a single truth, a single what it means to be Egyptian, Libyan, Tunisian. The what is called the Arab Spring, or the process of movements, struggle, transformation that took place, revealed that we have highly complex societies. We have societies where there are deep differences in wealth by regions within countries, where there are differences in class, in ideology, and this is where you bring in the issue of peace processes as well. The fundamental components of a peace process are that it needs to address the underlying root causes and drivers of what gave rise to the problems in the first place. It needs to be able to develop a commonly attractive vision of the future which meets the needs and interests of all the parties involved. And it needs to find a way of what happened during the Troubles. What happened during, how do we address what was done by different actors during periods of violence and confrontation? The reality is you don't always only need peace processes after a war. We face a challenge that very often when we speak about conflicts, people think war. And one of the things I say is that the first time you hear someone use the words pre-conflict or post-conflict, it is either a sign that they are lazy, have not seriously gone into their field, or are professionally and intellectually incompetent. Because when we use the word pre-conflict, what we're actually describing is pre-war. Before the bombing, before the massacre, before the killings. There were conflicts in Iraq before the invasion. There were conflicts around the world in relations to the US before the planes went into the buildings. There were deep conflicts in Syria before the violence broke out. In the same way, a treaty or a peace agreement which ends fighting does not necessarily address the underlying root causes of what gave rise to the violence in the first place. It doesn't necessarily mean that the conflicts have been transformed. So, for example, in El Salvador and South Africa, more people were killed in fighting in the years after the peace agreements than in any period during. So when we're speaking about peace building and developing effective ways of dealing with conflicts, we need to reorient from our focus on violence and only engaging once situations have reached crisis and wars, to engaging with conflicts. In that context, there can be a value in countries which have deep diversity and are trying to see how to deal with it, to develop conflict transformation and peace-building approaches. And that's one of the things that within Tunisia, within Egypt, there's a huge need for. The problem is when you add in elements of demonization, dehumanization of the other, creating strong enemy images, and win-lose approach to politics. And that can continue for a while, but it won't solve the problems.
Turkish crisis. I mean, dealing with the Armenian question, with the
dealing
Cyprus
with Armenian,
question.
dealing with Cyprus and others.
Yes.
One of the things that I would point to, which is very interesting, and this link to the question of MENA and others and the need to deal with the causes, one of the leading contributors in the field over many decades is an individual called Mary Fitzduff from Northern Ireland. And in looking at the Northern Ireland peace process, one of the elements that she highlights is very often we think that dealing with the root causes of problems takes place as a result of negotiations. There's a negotiation process, there's a peace agreement, and then change happens. What Mary Fitzduff looked at were some of the underlying causes of the conflict in Northern Ireland were issues such as unequal housing, unequal pay, lack of civil rights, protection for language, identity, freedom of expression, and also control of institutions by only one group. So, for example, the police were only coming from the Protestant community. The state was controlled by the Protestant community. During the Troubles, there were many different dynamics that took place, but one thing that evolved was a very interesting approach of the British government, where they began to bring about structural and institutional change even while the conflict was happening. So they brought about fair employment legislation, which dealt with the issue of unequal employment of people from different religious backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds. They brought about changes in housing policy. They brought about changes in the police structures. And rather than, as most academics and experts have traditionally looked at, peace agreement and then we address the issues, they transformed the context of the conflict. And that is what opened up for talks and engagement between the different parties. And in reality, there were actually secret back-channel processes bringing the actors together where these issues were identified and which led to these measures. So the quiet back-channel processes. Turkey getting support from others, the process in Cyprus, let's take that as one example. When we had the Kofi Annan process and you had massive mobilization in the Turkish Cypriot population and a strong yes vote, and then people expecting that you would have the same on the Greek Cypriot population, and the disappointment, the frustration would set in after. There has been a review of that after the fact. And people have recognized that solution of the Cypriot issue should have been one of the conditions for entry into the EU. And that if that had been carried out, that would have provided additional encouragement. Another factor is that they failed to engage with the Greek Orthodox Church. The process was negotiated between high-level political and state officials. On the Greek Cypriot side, there was not significant enthusiasm. They engaged with the process because they felt they had to, in part, with pressure from the EU. And that's not unusual that leaders aren't necessarily enthusiastic. That's happened on both sides in the Cypriot process. But one of the challenges was they failed to have effective conflict intelligence and understanding of the situation where the process addressed key issues relating to the interests of a major stakeholder on the island, the Greek Cypriot Church. If they had engaged with the church in dialogue and worked with them to transform them into a supporter of the process, then I believe you would have seen a supporting vote on the Greek Cypriot side. So one of the challenges, you cannot engage with peace processes detached from the reality of the society and the context. We need to both have the process and you need to have societal processes to gain support from key actors throughout. The problem is, and one of the reasons that we haven't seen significant support from the EU for effective engagement since, is they don't have a clear strategy and a clear understanding of what they can do. And this is where, at times, unilateral constructive measures by a side can have greater payback. So we can look at the 2015 anniversary and see that, yes, there will be mobilization from many who, from a perspective in it, have strong grievance in relation to the role that Turkey played and what happened on the 100 years ago. And that can often lead a country to take a defensive posture. We see that these are the enemy, they're complaining, they're now attacking us, this is offending our reputation, this is offending our identity, so we will not engage or we will lock down. Or you can have what's called the jujitsu approach. Take positive measures and transform that and actually be heralded. So right now, this is one of the outstanding unresolved issues which is negatively affecting Turkey's image internationally as well as an unresolved conflict in the region. Some positive steps have happened over the last years. But what is sometimes required is greatness of leadership. The ability to go beyond the continuing paradigms and narratives of a conflict and take the steps forward that would help for a solution. The benefits are significant. So the benefits in terms of, rather than a year of concentrated campaigning, identifying the failure of Turkey to engage, you would actually have a recognition of Turkey's significant step and leadership if there are efforts to address and solve this. In terms of the Kurds criticizing, or some of the Kurdish organizations and actors criticizing Turkey's role in Syria, and Syria at times criticizing some of the role of the Kurdish actors, I always find it funny in a conflict situation and when there's a peace process going on, when we complain that the other side is saying negative things about us. Yes, of course, it would be nicer if they were refraining and only saying positive things. But the reality is there is an outstanding conflict and there is an armed war going on nearby. That is not unusual. In many cases, you have had quieter processes, usually secret peace processes going on while the parties are even fighting each other. So it is important to recognize and raise awareness that statements from either side are not necessarily contributing to the process moving forward well, and at times can be disruptive to it. At the same time, I think there needs to be the maturity of understanding that that is going to happen. So in the worst case scenario, that is going to happen, we still move forward. In the best case scenario, you bring together the actors and you look at what can be a joint policy towards the area. Because there is a need for a new policy towards Syria. Not only on the part of Turkey, but on the part of all countries in the region. Just briefly to go into the two issues of global governance and the issue of xenophobia and Islamophobia. We are facing a major challenge that the system created after the Second World War is not meeting the scale of crisis that we are facing today. What I think is important is our diagnosis. We often blame the UN, what is the United Nations? The United Nations is the result of the choices made by the Turkish government, the US government, the Chinese government. If we blame the UN, then we become disillusioned and we think that it's the UN failing. We actually need to address our own governments and their foreign policies because they're the ones that sit in the Security Council and make the decisions. That's at the level of the UN Security Council and the General Assembly, the political governance organization. But otherwise, the UN system, the UN agencies and organizations are actually evolving rapidly and slightly getting better at dealing with some of these issues. We saw at the end of the Cold War the most successful period of the UN in contributing to mediation and peace processes, 1987 to 1993. There was the myth taught by many specialists in international relations and political science in the West and North America that the UN only became effective when the Soviet Union collapsed. And then it was freed from the Cold War confrontation. Actually, the UN was most effective in dealing with crisis in the period 1987 to 1993, when one of the superpowers had a policy of supporting the UN. Novoye politichesko myšlení, new political thinking in Gorbachev's foreign policy, where the Soviet Union proactively supported the UN and withdrew from supporting fighting factions and providing weapons to different areas. And at that exact same period in the State Department, you had a team that was getting involved in mediation. So you had the peace processes in Guatemala, El Salvador, Mozambique, Angola, and many other countries. I think what we actually need is what Turkey has shown a leadership role in playing with the Dialogue of Civilizations, with the Group of Friends on Mediation, with the annual conference in Turkey on mediation. We need individual countries, regional and global powers to take up key challenges and key issues, such as the mediation of violent conflicts, and to play a leadership role there and assist bringing together the United Nations as well as the spectrum of actors, governments, civil society, business, and others who are needed to help address these issues. And very, very briefly on one of the key issues, the rise of xenophobia within many countries, the rise of Islamophobia, and you can also look, for example, within Syria. If you spoke with Syrians 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, this was a society with tremendous degrees of tolerance amongst most of the population. People prided themselves on Syria being a myriad of different cultures and different peoples and traditions. Now, with the rise of the war, you have the killing, attacks, and executions of people because of their identity and where they come from. On October 12th, I was in Brighton, England. It was the 30th anniversary of the Brighton bombing. Do you remember that? When the IRA bombed the Tory party conference to kill Margaret Thatcher. I was invited there by two people. Jo Barry, her father was a member of the Conservative Party in Britain. He was killed in the October 12th bombing. And Pat McGee, the man who carried out the bombing. Jo and Pat have been working together They've been invited and they've traveled to Lebanon, they've traveled to Israel, Palestine, Rwanda, many other areas, to share the story of the difficult journey that they have made. One killed the father of the other, and coming from different sides in the conflict, speaking about the need to have the human courage to listen and to reach out across dividing lines. At the 30th anniversary, it's not only that Joe and Barry came together in Brighton to commemorate and to recognize this anniversary, but they were joined by a former member of some of the most extremely violent organizations acting in the name of Islam, or saying that they're Islamic organizations, those that were involved in the July bombings and attacks on London years ago, as well as many others, one of the former members. They were joined by a former white supremacist from the United States who had been involved in neo-Nazi and white supremacist movements. They were joined by a former gang leader from London. And they were joined by a former member of the British Armed Forces. These were all people who, in the name of different causes and different movements, were involved in the use of extreme violence against those they considered opponents, and very often against civilian populations. They were also joined by a survivor from Utøya, the massacre that happened in Norway on July 22nd some years ago. They were also joined by a survivor from the genocide in Rwanda, whose family was killed and who's been working for reconciliation and healing in Rwanda. And they were joined by members of the Parents Circle and Families Forum, Israelis and Palestinians whose children have been killed from the occupation and from the war, and who have come together across lines with the courage and the realism to recognize there can be no solution based upon denying the rights and the needs of the other. There can be no solution based upon the idea that my side is completely innocent and everything is the result of the other. But the title of the event was Beyond Violence, Injustice, and Extremism. What is the alternative? A review by U.S. intelligence services in 2006-2007 identified that the response of the U.S. government to September 11th, 2001 had increased violence and terrorism worldwide. The invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq. The response to conflicts by using violence is increasing extremism across the board. This is one of the most significant challenges facing us. And it requires engagement by those from within traditions, cultures, and beliefs, as well as across them. So it requires work by those in Western countries and North America to gain democratic control of our foreign policy, to prevent the ability of our states to wage war against foreign countries, and to change our understanding of how we deal with these situations. It requires engagement within our own societies to discuss how we deal with different populations. But I find it interesting that when we speak about the rise of Islamophobia, we also have to recognize that to be of different faiths in many Islamic countries today is significantly risky. If you are Christian or Jewish in Iraq, there are none left in most areas, because also internally there is Christianophobia, there is Judaicophobia. For hundreds of years, Jews and Muslims coexisted in rich peace. Jews were welcomed by the caliphate as brothers of the book and were scribes and learners within many of the areas. The conflict is not between Jews and Muslims. It is a conflict on the one hand of occupation in Israel and Palestine. It is two competing national quests of Jewish Israelis and Palestinians for homelands, and they haven't been able to find a way of solving that. But it is also a conflict of the failed model of states in the Arab world over the last 50 years. We've had fundamentally authoritarian, highly corrupt regimes that have failed to meet the needs of their populations and have used issues such as hatred of the other, Israel or others, to justify their regimes, and that is now changing. It is a period of turbulence and change if we engage with invasions, suppressions, or fueling weaponry and violence into that, that will destabilize the region for years and decades to come. Turkey is one of the few countries which has, in recent history, shown alternative policies and which has the potential to play a leading role in changing how these conflicts are being addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, since we don't have too much time, I think it's better to stop here. Thank you very much, Mr. Kai Jakobsen, and thank you very much for all of you for attending this conference. See you on our next conferences and events. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.